Okay. Good afternoon, my colleagues. I'm Hao Wu from WCO. Welcome to this panel on TF. As we are aware that the TF is always high on the agenda because it's a very good policy for trade and customs. And this year, for the PICARD this year, we are happy to receive a lot of submissions on this subject. And among the submissions, we selected some wonderful papers written by the authors. And here we'd like to form a panel composed with some panelists who are Andrew from UK and Frank from Germany and Etemadian from Iran. And today they will share with us their research on trade facilitation. So I'd like to give the first floor to Andrew. He will speak on bilateralism. What's the cost of customs and borders across the supply chain? So Andrew, the floor is yours.
I'll try and be ambitious, so let's get it going. Oh, here I am. There we go. So, there we are. Just in case I need some help in a moment. It's always nice to come to PICARD. I think this is the 4th or 5th conference I've attended. And for those who are not familiar, I've did quite a bit of work on trying to assess the costs, trade and customs procedures in the context of trying to, is it better? Trying to define trade facilitation. Some of my friends sometimes joke that they refer to me as Google Grainger. So if they've got a question, they just have to put my name in a search engine and somehow something about customs comes up. This presentation is to highlight some recent work that I've done together with Roel, Boriana, and Joha Tan, who can't be here today, where we have written a paper about some conversations we had amongst ourselves. So we are a team of researchers for this specific project. It's almost embarrassing. At least 15 years each of experience in trade and customs facilitation. And I've included a picture of me from about 10 years ago. And when we had this project, it was an opportunity to reflect on much of the work we have done. And a few things I will talk through were actually things I've actually presented at previous PICARD conferences, but in a new context. Part of the project was some generous funding from the European Commission, so it's the core project, and it allowed me, normally an academic based at the University of Nottingham, or an academic who works as a freelancer, to work also at TU Delft in the Netherlands for a few months. So this is the result of that work together with my colleagues Boriana, Roel, and Joha. And one of the questions that keeps coming up again and again and again in this context of customs and trade facilitation is, well, what are the costs? Why is it important? And understanding the costs is, I would argue, is a problem that never goes away. It's relevant to trade facilitation policy, because trade facilitation is about cutting red tape. It's about reducing transaction costs. It's also something very practical. Cost is a key variable in performance management. Understanding your organization, how it performs in terms of cost and value, those two variables are key when you aim for competitive advantage. If you want to make investments in new infrastructure, for example, a customs IT system, chances are, as a practitioner, you will be asked to conduct a cost-benefit analysis. If I invest this much money in a new system, what are the benefits that I will get out of it? As researchers, this is also quite interesting. There actually has been quite a bit of research about costs in international trade. But if you look at that research in detail, most of it relates to macroeconomic models, there's very little research that looks at the bottom-up, the operationally informed costs that practitioners, so people in business or in government, might experience on a day-to-day basis. And we also felt that describing costs is quite important if you want to manage costs, understanding what the costs are, where they come from, who's responsible for them. So these were all sorts of issues that when we sat down as a team and talked about costs arose in our team meetings. And this paper is a result of those conversations and matching and going back over our research to untangle it. And the problem about measuring, assessing costs is quite a difficult one. Certainly in trade, as you move goods from one country to the next, there are many stakeholders. It's a very fragmented system. And even those you would assume are experts often lack visibility of costs. So if you were, for example, to ask a multinational company, how much do you spend on customs declarations? There's a very good chance they will reply and say, we don't know. It's our agent, it's our broker who does that. So you ask the broker or the agent, and they say, well, we don't know because it's commercially confidential. Or we don't know because it's all electronic and we put lots of money in a big system, and now we're just trying to make money back. So understanding costs, making them visible, is quite a tricky problem. I'm not saying I have the answers, but it is a tricky problem. And just to put it into context, if you look at it from a government point of view, the system is no simpler. It's equally fragmented. So this is just how import operations in the United Kingdom would look like for meat. It's a big case study I did in 2013, and I think I shared it at the PICARD conference in St. Petersburg, the first findings of it. But if you were to draw it in a UML diagram, something the UNECE loves doing, you have the procedures, sort of go up the middle. You have the UK importers, so it could be the importer, maybe the bank that arranges for finance or provides for the guarantees for import licenses, and it will probably also include a freight forwarder or a broker or somebody conducting everything on your behalf. In the country of export, you might have exporters, freight forwarders, shipping lines. Thank you. I don't need to run. You might have other officials that are involved in it, such as, if it were meat, you would have an official veterinarian in the country of export. You will have the Chamber of Commerce that might issue an origin certificate. You will have another agency responsible for export licensing. There might be export procedures for the customs regime in that country from where the goods come from. So it becomes a really fragmented picture. And wherever you go, sometimes I do this as a living, if you start drawing these things out, it really does get complex. And attributing costs is no easy task. Much of the inspiration for this project actually came from something that the team in TU Delft are very much involved in. It's an idea that David Heskett first propagated and, well, was published in the World Customs Journal in 2010, the idea of a data pipeline. So recognizing you have all these different parties and all have information about something, and if you were to create a data pipeline where you can help yourself to information, it could make those goals in trade facilitation, such as eliminating the need for documents, eliminating the needs for making declarations, enabling border agencies to work together more effectively, possible. But certainly my colleagues at TU Delft very quickly run into an obstacle, which was that when they engaged the private sector about sharing information, they asked, well, what's the benefit of this? And what's the cost of building such a pipeline? So a very practical obstacle arose. You want to engage with a manager at a company and say, come and participate in our research project. It's a very large EU-funded project that might make trade much easier for you. And the first thing they ask is, well, how much will it cost me to participate? And how much will it cost me to develop the infrastructure? So very quickly, you realize it's cost benefits is not just something governments have to worry about, it's also something that businesses have to worry about when they make decisions about investing in IT infrastructure. So just going back, normally at home in trade facilitation, so yes, the focus of costs, the trade facilitation process is to reduce costs. Often from a customs administration perspective, it's about improving the performance. And in order to improve, it's often said you need to be able to measure. WCO had a whole publication on measuring by numbers. Cost-benefit analysis is a new concept I would like to introduce here in the context of, sorry, not new, it's something that's required in order to make investment decisions. And of course, as researchers, this is something that's quite interesting. Now, what we did is, the first thing is we started looking at existing models. And actually, there's quite a lot of material to draw inspiration from. So certainly, there are quite a few models that describe trade costs. And they would include categories such as transport costs, insurance costs, bank and financing costs, and something that's sometimes referred to loosely as value chain costs. So it's the cost of finding customers, identifying export markets, negotiating market access to new countries. And they sometimes talk also about regulatory costs or trade compliance costs. And this is sort of where this community, I feel, can really add quite a lot, and where we in our paper started offering first reflections, where we started trying to describe the trade compliance costs. And we're not the first to do this. I mean, it started quite early on, and certainly in the context of WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, when people started describing those costs in terms of direct and indirect costs. The direct ones being those that you face when you have to submit information to the authorities, and the indirect costs are those costs that follow when the procedures are inefficient and businesses might lose competitiveness and might find it difficult to participate in trade. But we felt just putting it in those two categories is probably not enough. And if we reflected on our research and all those people over the years that we've interviewed, as a few hundred, and forgive the small fonts, I'm just doing it to highlight that in the next edition of the World Customs Journal, you got full access to the model. And the type of cost categories that we're describing there relate to transaction costs. So that's the cost of employing a broker, the cost of appointing a freight forwarder. It's the cost of engaging with the customs administration, sharing information. There's also staff cost, employing people to do things. There are setup costs. Some people might refer to this as fixed costs, costs to buy infrastructure, to put fences around buildings, security cameras, all these sort of things. Then there are the transaction costs with the authorities, the cost of sharing information with them. There could be the indirect costs, such as loss of competitiveness. So if you find it's easier to comply in another country to the one you happen to operate in, you might find that business might locate there because that's a place where business can be done more easily. One of my favorite ones were psychological costs. This is inspiration from the tax literature. I mean, if anyone, you have to fill in a tax return and you feel like killing somebody at the end of it, I do. It's the hair you pull out, the anger you feel. But in the customs world, which in many parts falls under criminal law, this is a real thing. Maybe people are fearful of the customs administration, fearful of doing things because it could damage them in some way or other. They become stressed. And companies might suffer too when they might find it difficult to find the right people. Opportunity costs, the costs that you might invest or in a system, maybe you could invest it into something else that might make more profit. So you have to make trade-off decisions. Do I do this or do I do that? Commencement costs. In the UK, we're going through some very serious changes at the moment. So it's the cost of changing systems, adopting new laws, reconfiguring your systems, they come into play. And one key variable that we came to is the cascading costs. These are consequential costs, things that arise when something goes wrong. So, for example, you can't clear things at the border, your truck gets stuck, and as a result, you might have to find a new truck to pick up the cargo because the truck driver needs to rest or something like that. And certainly in this work that TU Delft did, the cascading cost was quite a big variable. So in our paper, we present 2 case studies where we reflect back on major work we did. So one is the UK meat import study. So again, going to this slide. And the sort of costs that you find there can be identified, can be put into 3 sort of areas. One is the setup costs with the authorities. So in order to be able to make a declaration, there are certain preconditions that need to be met with the import licensing agency, with customs, with Port Health. Port Health in the UK are our quarantine services. You might have to pay fees to third parties to connect to systems, to IT infrastructure and things like that. All this can amount quickly to several thousands of pounds. Then there are the transaction costs associated directly with the declarations. And then if you're unlucky, there might also be the inspection costs that follow from that. So a very simple categorization that followed on from reflecting back on this work. But I wouldn't be talking about trade facilitation if I wouldn't identify opportunities for cost savings. And there is a lot of duplication. So veterinary checks, certainly the European Union's regime that the UK enforces up to now, what it does is you've got the official vet in the country of export, and then you've got another official in the European Union doing a very similar check again, just to make sure that their colleague in the country of export did it. So there's duplication. Some countries are quite good at it. New Zealand, for example, have arranged a system where those checks are not quite so burdensome. So they might check far less, which means that certainly in my UK work, you can get a container of New Zealand lamb out of a port within 3 hours, but if it were Brazilian beef, it could take, if you were unlucky, a few days, if there was a weekend involved or something like that. If you did it really well, you probably could get it the next day. There's also duplication between customs, export, and import controls. There's also duplication in cost between what the buyer does and what the administrations do. Certainly at meat, 1 container of beef from Brazil was worth something like £140,000. This is something really valuable. If you place an order for that, you're going to make sure you're going to get what you ordered. So you will check yourself. You will have your own checks. So there's an overlap of your own checks against those done by officials. So again, there's a lot of scope for duplication. And with a trade facilitation hat on, you could think about maybe ways of cutting out maybe some of that duplication. Our other case study, this is where TU Delft was very much involved in, was the Kenyan-Dutch flower trade. So it's cut flowers from Kenya to be sent to Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands. Very, very time sensitive. And one of the key challenges with this project is that in the Netherlands, officials are only really able to determine where the customs control takes place when the plane lands. It might either be at Schiphol Airport, or it might be at Flora Holland's customs authorized warehouse. And that decision where customs will clear cargo depends upon the decision taken by the phytosanitary inspector whether they want to have a look at those flowers or not. And as a result, there are lots of cascading costs. So things like booking a truck, collecting the cargo from the airport, all these key decisions are delayed until there's certainty about the phytosanitary inspection decision. And as a result, you lose time, there's a lot of costs, and this is sort of cost that we felt previously had never been captured before. And certainly in the Dutch example, there are a lot of issues, the main one being that the phytosanitary declaration can only be lodged when the plane is about to land. You can't do it beforehand. It's really difficult for operators subsequently to schedule their vehicles to collect the cargo from the airport and either take it to the inspection facility or to the warehouse. So key decisions are delayed. And because those goods are still under customs control, if it has to go to the warehouse, you also, in addition, have got an additional customs regime to comply with, which is domestic transit in the Netherlands. And although this uncertainty only applies to 5% of the goods, only 5% of the flowers are inspected, it affects all goods, 100%, in terms of uncertainty and delayed decisions about when to pick up goods and how to deal with it from a compliance point of view. So you would think Netherlands doing business ranks really high up. Here they've got one area where things don't work quite so well, and trucks actually wait. So costs we have identified in the Netherlands are cascading costs, so those that all result from uncertainty about where customs clearance will take place. This is about when to book the truck, rebooking truck, sending the documents to the wrong office, it's things like that. And once you add that all together, you suddenly become more exposed to fines. There's a lot more communication costs. People spend a lot of time on the phone. Is it you checking it? Is it you checking it? Where does it go? Does it go to Schiphol? Does it go to your warehouse? It's all those sort of scenarios that add to the cost picture. Now, in the Dutch project, they did have a chance to play around with solutions. So in the as-is, with the decision being delayed until landing, most of the compliance operations take place after landing. So that's the phytosanitary inspection, the import declaration, and knowing where the goods will be cleared. What the Dutch did is they actually did a pilot with the Kenyan authorities to get the phytosanitary certificate earlier in an electronic form. So it meant the information could be received before the plane leaves, and it allowed the officials to make decisions about inspection and customs clearance before the plane arrives, so that the operators know when the plane arrives how to deal with that cargo. Do you take it to this customs facility, or do you take it to the other customs facility? So the as-is, where it's a bit delayed, it was named a bit mischievously as clearance in the sky, where all the clearance decisions were taken before the plane lands, and subsequently all the cascading cost, the uncertainty resulting from not knowing where cargo is to be cleared at the airport or at the warehouse, and where is it to be inspected, could be eliminated. But it required Kenyan officials and Dutch officials to work together to develop an electronic phytosanitary certificate, a document that previously had not existed. So why is this research interesting? Well, we did develop a cost model that's reflective. We certainly hope that the table that you can find in our World Customs Journal article will start helping develop some sort of taxonomy, some sort of standard where costs can be described. The variables, the names we allocated to it, you might have different labels for it. Maybe you disagree, but we call it psychological costs. Maybe you find cascading costs difficult. Language is not so important. It's more the fact that we have begun to have a discussion about the labels that you want to attract to different types of costs, so that you then could start measuring it. Maybe you can put it in the cost-benefit models. Maybe you could hold administrations accountable to it in the context of trade facilitation performance indicators or something like that. So a taxonomy, a standard, maybe a WCO one, who knows, where costs can be described and understood, so we develop a common language we certainly feel is a useful tool. We certainly realized that once we described what costs are to the people we interviewed, they became much more, oh yes, we have those costs too. And they said, oh, we also have these costs. And we, as researchers, we could really get very good narratives from that. We also understood that very practically, by being able to describe the as-is situation, how things are with costs, it became much easier to make the case for how the future could look like if you were to eliminate certain types of costs, like, for example, the scale of duplications. But we also had one very surprising finding. And although I'm somebody who's always been arguing for trade facilitation and weeding out costs to make trade facilitation possible, sometimes there are costs, and as important as trying to think about how to eliminate those costs. Sometimes it's just as important to start thinking about how to mitigate, how to reduce the impact of the cost. So, for example, if you had a decision to hold cargo at the port, and you only tell the truck company when they arrive at the port that your cargo is in customs and you can't pick it up, it's a wasted journey. Yeah, the truck driver, you had to pay for that person to go to the port, and then that person can't pick up the cargo. And I'm sure that's a scenario many of you are familiar with. If there were a way to communicate to the truck driver, no, don't come today, come tomorrow, then you could save that driver that journey. So you're developing measures that recognize costs might arise subsequent to an inspection, but by informing the other party early, that cost is managed. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't cascade into something bigger, like a wasted journey that would suddenly cost you £1,000 or maybe £2,000 a day, depending who you've recruited. So I leave this with you. Please take a look at the World Customs Journal article. Certainly over the next few days, I'll happily discuss this whenever you like. Recognize that our work is probably more a starting point, an attempt to describe costs, and I'm sure once people put their minds together, these models will evolve. Certainly, I would find it very interesting if, for example, in the context of performance management, you could work out costs as targets, bring them down to a certain level, but also in the context of trade facilitation policy, where it's not just about measures that try and reduce costs, it's also about measures that mitigate the subsequent impact of those costs upon business competitiveness in some way or other. So I'll leave it there, and I think I even have time for questions.
I think we can just have the Q&A just after all the speakers finish their work. So we can just...
Okay.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Andrew. You can show the time very well. And next, we'd like to have Frank present his research on bilateralism and unilateralism, the future of international trade relations. Okay, Frank, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hao, for inviting me, and thanks to the WCO to do this. Ladies and gentlemen, what I would like to do this afternoon here is to focus on a very different point. Andrew focused on the issue of trade facilitation. Trade facilitation is very much related to the technical aspect of international trade. What I would like to do is to draw your attention now to the, so to say, substantive side of trade liberalization. This will say the legal frameworks and the recent developments. So, it works. The departure point is very, very actual. For instance, you all have heard in the media about President Trump, the taxes and tariffs against products from China, for instance, the discussion about taxes and tariffs against other products that should be imported into the US. So this will say that unilateralism and also bilateralism are very, very much up to date. And the problem is that we observe during the recent years is that the world trade system on the multilateral level is very, very, very difficult to develop any longer forward. So what I'm going to say is that we had an expansion of the world trade system during the 19th. You might remember that the World Trade Organization was established. We received many of trade agreements on the multilateral level that were adopted in the middle of the 19th. But you will also remember that the Doha round of international trade negotiation started in the early 2000 years, but it is so difficult to further develop this round, and it is very close to fail. So we have a contradiction. On the one hand, the expansion of multilateralism in the 19th, and now we have a stadium of stagnation. But stagnation, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't mean that nothing works any longer in international trade. We observe a shift from trade liberalization from the multilateral level to the level of the free trade agreements, and especially to the bilateral agreements. And what I would like to do with you here in the next few minutes is to share some thoughts about the reasons of it and how the world trade order will further develop. So we had the Doha mandate that was really, really ambitious at the beginning of the 2000 years, and there were planned many, many trade liberalization. The abolishment or reduction of subsidies, of agricultural subsidies, for instance, enhancement of trade and services, and there was a very, very, very long list. I do not want to discuss everything. We won't have the time for this, but it was very difficult to conclude something. The only prominent result was the agreement on trade facilitation, but I mentioned that already. Trade facilitation is very much related to the technical aspect of international trade and not so much on the trade liberalization, the substantive side of trade. What we can observe is that on the one hand, we have really sound incentives for participation in the world trade system, but on the other hand, and that's a contradiction, we have decreasing interest in further development of the world trade system. And how could it come that we have this contradiction right now? First, I would like to address some points why to join the international trade system. So the first very important point is that we have welfare gains arising from market liberalization. That sounds a little bit academic, but that's a very good foundation of international trade. And you will remember that we have the classical foreign trade theory that says the more we trade, the more welfare we have, the better we are off at least. For instance, according to Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, Chicago School, and all these things. But that's what we find in the books. That's very theoretical. But now we know that more and more trade may be beneficial for us, but not necessarily and not in every respect. So we have to define carefully in which respects more trade can cause more welfare and in which regard not. Yes, the more we trade, the more we have a reduction of information costs with respect to international trade. And another very important point is that big trading partners can more easily affect the terms of trade and the behavior of others than they can under the conditions of bilateral trade relations. There is a very, very good example. Take the role of the United States, for instance, before the fall of the Iron Curtain. During the 70 years, the 80 years of the last century, the United States and the other Western industrialized countries were able to govern the system, so to say, and the system corresponded very much to their interest. And the question occurs, what about the others? Other incentives to join the multilateral system. For instance, a very important point, participation in an anti-discriminatory, rule-oriented system. You will know that we have the WTO dispute settlement system, and that's rule-based and not power-based, so that all smaller states can pursue their legal rights and their interest. So, on the one hand, we can say that international trade may offer substantial benefits for all industrialized emerging countries as well as developing countries. But why then did the Doha round come so close to collapse, and why was it so difficult to reach even a minimal consensus? So, is the first assumption not right? Question mark. Or what could be the solution of this contradiction? The question remains still in the room. I try to give you some ideas of explanation. First, we have differing interests of the industrialized countries, developing countries, and emerging powers. And the more countries which are in the club, the more difficult it is to find common interest. I mentioned already that the whole WTO system and the former GATT legal system was more or less dominated by the Western world. But now we have emerging powers, emerging trends, emerging countries like China, like India, and they play a more and more important role in global trade. And this will say that the balance of political power is shifting. It is not only the West anymore who can dominate the system, because others are playing more and more a very important role. And we still have a lot of conflicts within the WTO system. When we think back to the 19th, when the WTO was founded, everybody was relaxed and happy, and we said, we made it, everything is adopted. But then, many questions occurred. For instance, do the global liberalization concepts really fit to the needs and strategies to other countries, like developing countries? And we can say that there is no coherence in many aspects. We can say that especially the developing countries did not participate equally like the Western countries did from the system. So the question remains how developing countries could be much better integrated into international trade, and it lasted a long time to give answers, also given by the representatives of free trade. Another aspect I would like to point out is the absence of strategies to implement the overarching issues of the WTO legal framework. You may know the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement governing the WTO legal agreements. So there we find overarching issues like full employment, for instance, like environmental protection, social protection, protection of human rights, and so on. And the question is, in how far does international trade do the protection of all these issues? The representatives from the GATT Secretariat neglected a long time this connectivity between so-called non-economic issues and economic trade issues. But now we know that there is a very strong connection, but the challenge remains to have a deep analysis how the interaction between both issues is about, and how we can bring both very important issues into coherence and not into contradiction. Other issues I would like to point out, points of criticism, are, for instance, negative effects of international trade on sovereignty in various fields of politics and competitiveness. Just think about environmental protection. If countries have a lack of environmental protection, they may have sometimes a strong international competitivity. So there might be a contradiction between international trade and environmental protection or social welfare, social wages, and so on. And the last point I would like to mention in this context are the free trade agreements. They are becoming more and more an alternative to multilateralism, opening up new opportunities. What can free trade agreements do more than the multilateral system can do? There is one very, very important issue, and that is the advantage that free trade agreements are concluded only between a smaller number of participants. For instance, 5, 6, 7 participants, sometimes in form of bilateral agreements, only 2 participants. And this means that they have more common interest many times, and they can negotiate preferential conditions among each other. And these preferential conditions can leave outsiders away. They are worse off, and the members of the club are better off. And just in recent years, it becomes more and more important to find special systems within the whole multilateral system that better fit to the needs of certain countries. For instance, take the example of China. It would be impossible to pursue the One Belt, One Road strategy in the framework of the multilateral trade system. Of course, the multilateral trade system is the basis of everything, and it governs our daily economic life. The WTO is not dead. Many people say it's dead, but it's still living because we have the legal texts and the system is working. The point is that we cannot further develop it at the moment. But for instance, China is looking within this One Belt and One Road initiative to deepen the international relations with the countries along the Silk Road. And this means that they want to pursue the trade connections with these countries among 2 partners, among 3 partners, but not with all the partners that belong to the whole world trade system. This means China is looking for preferential trade conditions among a few number of partners alongside the Silk Road. And therefore, we need new forms of trade system, and bilateral and free trade agreements can much better fulfill these overarching issues. What is the consequence of that? We have a shift from regime creation to a shift of regimes to free trade agreements and bilateral agreements. There was one big regime created, the multilateral trade system during the 1990s, and now we have a shift from interest to trade among a smaller number of trading partners in other forms of trade liberalization. And the question is there a minimal number of coalitions willing to further develop the world trade system in future, under the conditions that free trade agreements and bilateral trade agreements can many times better fulfill their genuine interest? And then quite another question occurs: what will be the future of our world trade order? Will our world trade order in the future, in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, be the same like it was before, for in the 19th or in 2000 or like today? And I would like to argue, no, it will be different. What we had is more or less the past. So we can say that we are at the crossroads and we are entering into a new era of international trade. We have 2 opposite models. The first one is the world trade order that existed as we know it so far. That is a multilateral liberal system dominated by the Western world, at least based on cooperation among states until the early 90 years. But can we say that we have already a new world trade order? I wouldn't argue this way. Well, it's not black and white. There are so many shadows of gray. But what we can say is that we are leaving the status of this old world trade order we had before, and we are entering into a new future. We don't know how it's looking like. But this new or upcoming world trade order is much more dominated by national interests. Have a look at the politics of President Trump, for instance, increased unilateralism. That might be one example. And it's not so much based on the multilateral system like we had it the times before. Before the fall of the Iron Curtain, we had a westernization of world politics. I mentioned that already. So international trade was dominated by the Western states, by the Western industrialized states, including the US. The US was the leader, the motor of the whole system. And this corresponded to the overall political status of the bipolar world. You remember that we had, on the one hand, the US as one pole and the former Soviet Union on the other hand. And this old system, this bipolar system, broke down in the 19th, while the former Soviet Union came to an end. But what happens afterwards? What we can say for sure is that the old bipolar system doesn't exist anymore. But it's difficult to say what the future will bring. It is a multipolar system where many actors are, like China, emerging countries, India, for instance, some other countries, and the significance of some Western-oriented countries will be decreasing. So we are speaking of Westernization politics before the status of the Iron Curtain, and now we are in a period of de-Westernization of world politics, point. But what comes next? Question mark. So I said it's too difficult or it's impossible to say that we are already in the stadium of a new world trade order. But we can say that the new status that will come up has certain characteristics, and I would like to share with you some thoughts about these new characteristics. The first one is that we have an increasingly important role of the emerging country. Take the example of China. China is developing so quickly, and it's for sure that China will play another very important role in 5 or 10 years as today. Another point, more players with more political and economic influence, greater fragmentation of interests. That's a consequence of that. And the states are looking for selective trade opportunities and demonstrating a stronger interest in protectionist strategies. I feel that's really important because it's a question of time that the emerging countries will threaten more and more the competitive abilities of the Western world. And it's for sure that the Western world will become more and more into a defensive than offensive position. Then, establishing networks beyond multilateral governance of the WTO, less interest in being integrated into the multilateral system. Nevertheless, the multilateral system will be very important for the future. It's the basis of our trade, but we will have more and more free trade agreements and especially many bilateral agreements. So we can say at least there will be no new world trade order in the sense that such an order could completely replace the existing order so far. But we are in an intermediary stadium. We observe a shift from multilateralism towards layered system of market liberalization and protectionism. And layered systems of market liberalization means the countries involved are looking for their own interests. They want to pursue their own interest in specified and specialized forms of trade liberalization, others than the overall world trade system. So we can say, on the one hand, we have the general old world trade system, and on top of that, we will have an increased number of specialized trade agreements. But the question that remains is, can a world trade order that is much more based on nationalism and protectionism be seen as just and fair more than it has been before? Ladies and gentlemen, is justice and fairness somewhere to see in the legal texts of the world trade system? Is there a special article where we find justice and fairness? Or if we have a look at the new free trade agreements or bilateral trade agreements, do we find some fairness and justice in there? So, where's the place of justice and fairness? I strongly think that international legal text and an international legal order can only exist if the people think that it is somehow just and fair. We need the feeling. We wouldn't accept a world order, international agreements that are not, indeed, not just and fair. But where's justice and fairness located? And will bring bilateralism and these free trade agreements more justice and fairness? That's an open question, and I very much like to give this question to you as an open question, so take it back home and think about it. It does matter so much. We talked already so much about legitimacy of the world trade system. The world trade system was many times accused not to be really legitimate because there are no democratic processes, because the people are not able to vote for the world trade system in their countries. But the same is true that we have perhaps a lack of legitimation, of democratic legitimation of the free trade agreements and bilateral trade agreements. And again, the question of justice and fairness, and how could it be arranged that all these trade agreements and this new world trade order could accord to the interest of the people. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thanks, Frank. So the third speaker would be Etemadian. Etemadian, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the organizers of this conference. Paper subject identification and prioritization of strategic factors affecting empowerment of human research to electronize cross-border trade. Case study of customs Iran. How many questions or remarks you can comment, send my email address Sajad Etemadian @gmail.com. So, introduction. The old pattern of self-management is currently out of practice in a large number of organizations. The modern organizations not only need to the more extent to knowledge and information, but also they need to the more autonomy, self-reliance, self-confidence, creativity, and innovation. Employees power empowerment is one of the most hopeful concepts in business world, which has not been significantly considered so far. Notwithstanding numerous discussions about its advantage, it has been significantly utilized. Empowerment is indeed an effective and pioneer technology which makes some advantage for the firms and make entrepreneurship for the employees. Empowerment allows the managers to utilize knowledge, competence, experience, and motivation of all staffs in the organizations. Participation of the staffs and empowerment, them are new techniques for releasing human-oriented and capabilities in the organizations. The main objective is transferring power and granting deciding rights to the lower levels by use of some concepts like common ideas. Feature and motivation staff to excite a sense of pride, self-confidence, self-respect, and responsibility in them. Empowerment is based on one of its aspects on conception, technique, and performance, which includes high participation of the staffs. Empowerment indeed relies on this conception that the person who currently performs work comprehends on the work better than higher level managers of the organizations. Therefore, according to the structure of executive custom office in Iran, it is required to study human resource to this organization. To this effect, in this research, we indeed assess empowerment extent and determine contribution of each factor in human resource empowerment in executive custom office. The research conceptual model, you see input model, training, mission and vision, access information, access to research, communication, encouragement. Output this model, efficacy, self-esteem, effectiveness, personality, reliability, others. Hypothesis. Research methodology. The statistical population in this descriptive survey research includes staff of Iran Executive Custom Office, 6,200 people that the sample size was determined at 360 people, according to Morgan table. Since the experts and evaluators' work was the same, simple random sampling method was used. Library studies and internet were used for gathering data, and the researcher made questionnaire prepared by PICARD, 7 items. With 49 questions was used for gathering data required for the research. The statistical method, including Friedman test, regression test, t-test, and Pearson test, we were used for analyzing data. SPSS and AMUS software was also used. Research findings. You see description studies relating any elements, for example, training parts. Question 1 to question 6. In this table, you see that all elements are verified. And next table. Descriptive studies of questions relating to mission and vision part of organization. It is verified. Descriptive studies of question relating to the part of access information, question 17 to question 23 all of the verified descriptive statistics of questions relating to the part of access research, all of the verified descriptive statistics of questions relating to the part of communication, question 3.1 to question 3.5, all of the verified part of encouragement and incitement, question 3 to question 41, and in a part of information system and information technology, question 22 to question 48, all of the verified. We have this research 6 hypotheses and 2 questions. Hypothesis 1, 80. It seems that there is no significant relationship between training and human resource empowerment. H1 is opposite H0. You see training Pearson correlation sufficient. H0 is reject. Based on the data obtained in this table, H0 is reject. Hypothesis 2. It seems that there is no significant relationship between the organization mission and vision and human resource empowerment. H1 is opposite H0. Based on the data obtained from Pearson correlation in this table, H0 is reject. Hypothesis 3. It seems that there is no significant relationship between access to information and human resource empowerment. H1 is opposite H0. Based on the data obtained from Pearson correlation, is this table H0 is reject. Hypothesis 4, H0. It seems that there is no significant relationship between access to resource and human resource empowerment. H1 is 0, H0. H1 is opposite H0. Based on the data obtained from Pearson correlation, is the table H0 is reject. Hypothesis 5. It seems that there is no significant relationship between communication and information technology and human resource empowerment. H1 is opposite H0 based on the data obtained from the Pearson correlation. Is this table H0 is reject. Ultimately, hypothesis 6. It seems that there is no significant relationship between the employees' encouragement and incitement and human resource empowerment. H1 is opposite H0. Based on the data obtained from the Pearson correlation, is this table H0 is reject. You see regression model by adding one unit to training standard deviation, the empowerment will increase to 0.244 by adding 1 unit to organization's mission and vision, 1 unit to a standard deviation of access to information. The empowerment will increase to 0.13 by adding 1 to a standard deviation of access to resource. We will see increase in empowerment for 0.399 by adding 1 unit to a standard deviation of communication and information technology. The empowerment will increase to 0.397, and by adding 1 unit to a standard deviation of incitement and encouragement, we will see increase in empowerment for 0.11. Since cost sufficient have been standardized in the equation, we can easily understand effect of each variable on depending. We have two questions this paper. Question one, how is priority of effective factors in human resource empowerment from the viewpoint of executive custom staff? Upon analyzing Friedman test the rank mean of a statistical sample of finding indicate among effective factors in human resource empowerment factors, including reward 14.24, training 16.23, communication and information technology 15.001, access to information 14.11, access to resource 13.85, organization mission and vision 13.23. Have the most and lowest important respectively. Question two. Which effective factor in executive custom human resource empowerment has the most effect? This table indicates the regression equation among the 6 factors recognized as effective factors in executive custom Iran. Customs human resource empowerment has entered 4 elements in regression model. Therefore, 4 variables, including reward, training, communication and information technology, and access to information. Finally, from the model, each variable identifies contributes in variance of empowerment variable by entering into the equation. Totally in model 1, the variables of access to information 0.696 contributes 0.70 from empowerment variable variance in model 2, the variables of communication and information technology 0.781. Contributes 0.78 from empowerment variables variance in model 3. The variable of training 0.897 contributes 0.90 from empowerment variable variance, and finally, in model 4, the variables of incitement and encouragement, the 0.944 contributes 0.994 from of empowerment variables variance to themselves. By adding each of the above variables, variance is reduced. Conclusion. As it is indicated in this research, the objective of the research is identification and prioritization of effective factors in human resource empowerment to electronic cross-border trade in customs, Iran customs. After a large number of studies and assessments performed by the researcher, eventually according to the organizational structure of custom organization and nature of working this organization, 3 factors variables which have the most importance in human resource empowerment from the viewpoint of the researcher and employees were identified, including training, access to information, access to research, communication and information technology, and organization mission and vision. The finding of this research indicates that among effective factors in human resource empowerment factors, including reward, training, communication and information technology, access to information, access to research, organization, mission, and vision have the most and lowest importance, respectively. In executive custom organization, reward is the most important factor, and recognizing organization, mission, and vision has the lowest importance for the staff. In this question of the research, which effective factors in empowerment are more effective rather than other factors effective in human resource empowerment, the finding obtained from regulation indicate that the 6 factors relating to human resource empowerment. Just 4 factors, including reward, training, communication, and information technology, and access to information, are considered as the most important factors in human resource empowerment. Human resource in executive custom organization, the most important factors in reward, and the lowest important factor is organization mission and vision. Therefore, in customs organization, since they are in relation with financial and commerce, e-commerce affairs, they need more facilities with respect to incitement and encouragement, which may lead to motivation in employees' empowerment and increasing administrative health. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Etemadian. It's a very interesting research from the perspective of human resources, and I think your research could be part of the custom performance measurement if Brian agrees with me. Thank you again for all your very good presentations, Andrew, Frank, Etemadian. I think this panel is very cross-cutting. We have covered extensively the topics on trade costs, world trade order, and human resources. And I think all the topics are related to trade facilitation. As we can see, trade costs are about why we should have trade facilitation, and the system for trade rules is about how we just set up norms on trade facilitation. And Etemadian's research is very interesting. It's about how the customs administrations could facilitate trade institutionally. So I'd like to give some time to the audience for your questions, and please make sure your question is very brief and very straight, and the panelists would be happy to answer. Okay.
It's very hard work for interpreters when we're starting to say something without microphones. Once again, my name is Wes Krzyżowicz. I am from Poland. I am former Director General of the Polish Customs Service and very good friend for Andrew and Frank for since I think almost 20 years. But both the presentation are very good, and in this situation I have some questions. Andrew, to you, because it is excellent first step, as I understand, according to your last words. But what about the next one? It's necessary to provide field studies with partners in this delivery chain, because, as you know, it's necessary to measure the first, not only money directly, how it costs, but the time. Time is money. How is lasted each of these part of delivery chain? And that is the question to you, because I think it will be better, the summary report, when we can show to all our partners in business and in customs how it's necessary, not it possible, but it's necessary to introduce this reduction instrument. It's so many, starting with the ICT communication and cutting the paper documentation. That is to you. And Frank, I'm depressed after your presentation. It's really very black picture. Yes, I agree with you. That's true. But maybe something optimistic, light in the tunnel. It's the Bali package, and particularly Trade Facilitation Agreement Convention, which was introduced into GATT as amendment. Because really, without international regulation, it's impossible to develop our trade connections under the stupid, selfish political pressure. But I hope that it will be only temporary, and in the future, the role of WTO as well as WCO will be excellent and could regulate all these difficult, very difficult problems for today. Thank you very much.
Just a quick point on the next steps. I mean, you're absolutely right. We're just scratching the surface, and our work is a reflective piece of work. And it certainly would be useful to become better at describing the experience costs. It can also inform the type of regulatory regimes we would want, so that links into the sort of Frank sort of world. And certainly, coming from the UK, understanding costs at the moment is a very, very political issue. And that leads us to one very practical question, which is that costs are incredibly subjective. They depend on the perspective you take. Quite often, they can't be quantified in a macro-type context that economists might like. They are unique to organizations, and one organization will experience cost very differently to the next. And just observing the Brexit debate in the UK, you had business leaders saying, Brexit is good. And then the next business leader said, no, it's a disaster. But they had very different interests, very different organizations. And the context behind describing those costs is, I believe, very, very important.
Yes, Wes, I think you're completely right. The trade facilitation agreement is very, very important. Trade liberalization is on one hand, but we need to pursue trade liberalization on the technical side, and the technical side is what matters at least, to bring trade liberalization to the ground at least. And therefore, the trade facilitation agreement is really a very, very, very important intermediary result of this Doha round, although the other issues failed more or less. Of course, there were smaller side agreements that were adopted, but the agreement on trade facilitation is really, really important. It's a big step forward. You are saying the perspective is depressive. That you might think that, and I'm fighting for myself in me to not deem it to be so depressive. I think there are many, many open questions, and one of them is, for instance, whether the unilateral action of President Trump, for instance, will continue at least. It's not sure whether this will be a longer state of play, or it will be a short-term reaction that could be corrected. We don't know. So it's open, and we should also keep in mind that the new developments always offer new opportunities. And we should focus on these opportunities that free trade agreements offer and bilateral agreements. And we have indeed the multilateral trade system as a basis. But the question is, what will happen if, for instance, President Trump neglects the world trade system and devise more and more measures and doesn't care about the legality of everything. That would be really a tough attack to the world trade system, but it's not gone so far in the moment. So I would say let's focus on the positive aspects. Although you are right, there are many, many things that make us think about it and make us worrying.
Thank you very much for all the presenters, for the nice and brief presentation. I have one question for each of the presenters. First, I will start with Andrew. My question is, in order to reduce the cost of trade, rather than calculating the direct costs, which are the fees and charges collected by customs and other regulatory agencies, how can we calculate, how can we change the time to trade to the cost? For example, due to a number of unnecessary customs procedures, there are delays. So those delays must be changed to the cost. Especially a trader may want to reduce the clearance of his goods by changing the tariff value of each day. So can we calculate the time value of delay to the cost of trade rather than adding the costs collected by the other regulatory agencies? The question for Frank is, I have heard a new approach for trade, that is the new world trade approach. So how this is applicable to developing countries, especially given the low bargaining power and low products of export for developing country, how developing countries can implement this new trade policy by avoiding multilateral trade agreements and referring to regional trade agreements. So is it applicable especially for developing country? This is my question. I will also have one question to Etemadian. I saw in the presentation, the organization vision and mission is one factor of human resource development. So how do you see this? How this affects human resource empowerment? This organizational mission, setting this organizational mission, I haven't ever heard such kind of, it is new for me. So how do you see this affect human resource empowerment? Thank you very much.
No, this is a really interesting comment. It's the question of how to equate time to cost. And I guess in the trade facilitation community, we don't do ourselves any favors when we have studies like time release studies, or when the World Bank starts talking about time as a key variable when it assesses countries and the like. Certainly in our work, time would be worth something different to different parties. If your goods are not worth very much, time is probably not as important either. So if low-value goods, and it stays in the port a little bit longer, so what? Maybe a bit of demurrage, but it's not as important if you've got high-value goods. And for others, it's not so much time, and this was certainly the case with the Flora Holland work in the Dutch study, in our Dutch case study. It was not so much time, it was predictability and certainty that was the key point. So time is an element, yes, it's perishable goods, but more important was knowing at what point in time decisions are taken so you can take the right action. And if you know things are going to be delayed, and that's communicated early, you can put mitigating measures in place. If you don't know when those measures are take grip, then costs escalate. So time is not really the variable, it's more about predictability. Some people, especially in logistics, sometimes get annoyed about the phrase just in time. Sometimes I teach logistics, and then I always say it means not too late. It's making sure it arrives when you need it. It's not necessarily about speed. And this is where macroeconomists, I would argue, often misinterpret what time means in terms of cost. And that's why, again, it's very important we collect the narratives, the stories, the perspectives behind what time, for example, and other cost variables might mean.
I would like to come back to the question how the developing countries could position themselves against this scenario of increased bilateralism and free trade agreements. I think it's still an open question. Of course, we observe increased regionalism in Africa. We have the strategies of the African Union to create a pan-African free trade zone and so on. These are sometimes theoretical thoughts and that have to be implemented into practice, but these are already initial steps. But the answer to this question still remains open. And we can also say that the increased bilateralism reflects trade negotiations under very asymmetric conditions. In many cases, we have the bigger trading partners who are looking for bilateral trading opportunities. And then we have the picture where one bigger trading partner negotiates with a smaller one. And that's really asymmetric, and bilateral agreements are many times accused to create unequal trade opportunities for the smaller country involved.
Thank you for your question. Pearson correlation sufficient shows a positive and relatively weak relationship equal to 0.246 between the organization mission and vision and human resource empowerment. Since the significant level of the obtained correlation is less than 0.05, therefore the relationship is significant. By 95% reliability, it can be said that the better than more explicit is organization, mission, and vision. It has more influence on human resource empowerment.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. I would like to ask my question to Mr. Grainger. Okay, can you hear it now? Firstly, with regard to the customs cost, maybe we can call it as foreign trade operation costs, because when we call it as customs costs, it seems like that all the costs are stemming from the customs operations. But as during your presentations, the participants also saw that there are some procedures with regard to the other border agencies, such as Agriculture Authority, Health Authority, and etc. And my question is exactly with regard to the pre-arrival processing mechanism. During your presentation, you said that with regard to the Netherlands, especially on phytosanitary declarations can only be lodged when the plane is about to land. Maybe there are different participants from economic operators, academia, and customs. But many of us know that there is a trade facilitation agreement, and trade facilitation agreement has a categorization with regard to the implementation, ABC rule. And all the developed countries, and EU is one of them, is categorized under category A. That means they should be implementing the agreement already. But with regard to the phytosanitary declarations, maybe there can be different interpretations, but it seems radically against the WTO rules on trade facilitation agreement, especially with regard to the Article 7.1, the pre-arrival processing. Maybe WCO side can also have better information with regard to this type of technical issues. Because as Turkey, during the last meeting of the WCO, we proposed to make any additional agenda items of the upcoming meeting of the WCO Trade Facilitation Working Group to include the pre-arrival processing mechanism as well. And when we look at the pre-arrival mechanism, the import declarations and all the submitting documents should be enabled to submit before the arrival of the goods. This means that customs and other border agencies, this also includes the agricultural authorities, must start the risk analysis before the physical arrival of goods to determine which products will be controlled and to determine, if possible, the control level, whether it will be partial or full control or laboratory analysis. Therefore, I am not sure whether the data on the presentation is correct, but if it is so, it seems a little bit against the WTO trade facilitation rules. I know there is no any mechanism yet with regard to whether in place the developed countries are implementing the rules of WTO trade facilitation agreements really or not. But if the data is really correct, we should consider this item with regard to the maybe bilateral meetings with the Netherlands and EU. Thank you very much.
I mean, you raise a very important point. There's two things to consider within that. One is that the obligations of customs to do pre-arrival declaration or processing, in different countries, customs have different functions. So in the Netherlands, phytosanitary is not part of the customs capability. And unfortunately in the European Union, as in most other parts of the world, as I'm aware, phytosanitary certificates are still paper documents. So it might be possible for customs to do much of the risk analysis before goods arrive and then complement the picture once more declarations are done through pre-declarations and the like that. But until the phytosanitary declaration is in electronic format, that becomes very difficult. And this is what made the Dutch project so interesting. As researchers, they developed an electronic phytosanitary certificate and trialed it between the Kenyans and the Dutch authorities, and it worked. So suddenly you could do clearance in the sky. So in this case, it's an example of how academic research with strong practical involvement with stakeholders in Kenya and the Netherlands could demonstrate that you can take key decisions, such as processing a declaration early, before the plane lands, as opposed to when the plane lands. But you're right, in the perfect world, we could do this all way beforehand, especially when you think about the fact that the person who issued the phytosanitary certificate would have done, hopefully, a check as well. So do we really need to do another check at this end? These are other questions that are worth asking, but very valid and interesting.
Actually, I'll give the floor to the gentleman there.
Yeah.
Okay.
My question is to Mr. Andrew. You mentioned cost saving about accepting documents issued by exporting country and to accept the same to the importing country, that example, the phytosanitary certificate. I have two practical examples or the issues which we accepted the documents issued by the exporting country, phytosanitary certificate. One is issued in respect of a canned fish, other one is issued in respect of rice. Both are for human consumption. Later on, we allowed the clearance through the importer's warehouse with condition that cargo, the consignment should not be disposed or offered for any sales until the local laboratory test is carried out for compliance. When the test was carried out, the test reports reveals the standards fail in both occasions. So in the one occasion, the canned fish, the level of acceptance is greater than the accepted norms. So that consignment was rejected. Then it has to be re-exported to the source country. So we had serious issues in that. As a custom authorities, we accept as a trade facilitation measurements. So in the second consignment, that was a rice consignment, whereas the certificate was issued after the consignment was put on board. When it was, we had a doubt about the genuine or the documents issued by the authority. So we examined the document, then I was the officer to prosecute the case in the domestic inquiry. We found the data mismatched, and it was issued on a fraudulent manner, and it's a forged document. But whereas the exporting country, custom has certified that document. So we checked with the custom, they said yes, it is issued by them, their authorities, whereas it is forged. So in such a situation, what would you advise to the custom administration to facilitate trade? Thank you.
I mean, it's a common issue, and many of the checks exist precisely because the authorities in the other country are not quite trusted, and they have discovered errors, mistakes in the documents, so you better check than be sorry. But you could argue that by working with those authorities to eliminate those mistakes, you could collaborate rather than duplicate the efforts. And there are examples. So you could, for example, consider a veterinary certificate as proof of origin, because the person who examined the meat originally knows where it comes from. That's their job. And so long as you've got mechanisms in place to trust that official veterinarian, you could use that instead of an origin certificate. New Zealand does some things really well when it comes to managing their meat supply chains. So there, an export license would also be recognized by the European Union as an import license. So the importer doesn't have to apply for an import quota because the export has already done it via the New Zealand authorities. There's a very high level of trust and integration. So I guess this is where you have, I mean, in the customs world, we're familiar with it, where we have contact groups and officials meet maybe once a year, every half a year, and exchange and develop relationships of trust. And then eventually, you know, you've got mechanisms in place to make sure that the data is accurate. But having said that, we are in very interesting times. And if you think about the data held by the private sector, if there were incentives for them to share that information, there's no way of it to become corrupted when it turns into paper documents that's shared. And this is, again, the Dutch study was interesting because the phytosanitary certificate is communicated from the Kenyan authorities directly to the Dutch authorities, whereas the paper document goes from the Kenyan authorities to the trader, from the trader to the importer in the Netherlands, and then to the authorities. So it's a business-to-business channel, whereas if you develop relationships directly between the administrations, perhaps the data will be of a better quality. And that's the whole idea of David Heskett in 2010 about the data pipeline. Including building trust and confidence in each other's capabilities, yes. So.
Okay, thank you for all the questions and replies. I think trade facilitation is a big topic, as always, and we can talk a lot on this subject. And if you have any questions or comments or any other ideas, I think you can just continue talking with panelists here during the coffee break or tea break and during these days. And thank you all, the panelists, for your wonderful presentations, and thank you for coming here. And I think it's time for our coffee break, and we'll come back at, let me see, yeah, we're a little bit delayed. So we'll just come back at 3:40. Okay, see you soon.